Goedemorgen. Ik ben heel blij vandaag hier te zijn. And this is about all the Dutch I can still manage. So let's go back to English afterwards. I'm going to talk about awesome productivity with Angular 2. Why are we doing this in the first place, right? So the whole point of Angular JS, Angular 2, the whole ecosystem is being productive, having fun, building awesome applications for our users. So that's our overall goal, and everything else follows from this goal, what we're doing. And that's also the reason why we're building Angular 2 in the first place. So Angular 2 is, as you know, is a big departure from Angular 1, and you could say it's a rewrite, right? We have to be honest, it is actually a rewrite. We really rewrote Angular 1 from the ground up into Angular 2. Everything changes. Everything does really change. There's most stuff that is Angular related in your application will change in this. And, you know, oh no, right? This is happening. Oh no, panic. But don't worry, it's okay. So the reason why we do these things is not we got drunk and we're bored and wanted something else to do. We actually have good reasons why we do things, and we actually do think they are a massive improvement for everybody building applications, for everybody using Angular. So we think this will actually pay off very quickly for people. You will have to learn new stuff. There's new exciting stuff, but it will make you so much better, so much more productive. It will be so much more fun building applications. And so that's the whole point why we're doing this. And we're working on making this a very smooth experience. So we're not dumping you somewhere and just going to be on a nice another island. We will actually help you to move you over to Angular 2. So the reason why we do this is not really so much from ourselves. It's the web has moved. If you think about it, Angular, the first beginnings of Angular are even older, but Angular was about 5 years ago. The fundamental way how Angular 1 works was planned and designed and built. And the web has moved a lot in between. So NPM has become a big thing. Node has become a big thing. ES6 has become a big thing. People actually use build tools. People use modules in their applications. People use classes and arrow functions and all this new stuff that you have in ECMAScript 6. And with transpilers like Babel or like Tracer or Typescript, these things become usable for us even if the browsers are not quite there yet with the implementation. So all of these things are happening, and all of the frameworks that we have, not just Angular, will have to adjust to that, right? You actually have to redesign your framework if you work under the assumption that there are modules. So this whole you might know from Angular, they have the module system that is built into Angular 1. This is kind of weird if you also have ES6 modules. It doesn't make sense anymore, right? Or the way how we specify directives in Angular 1 no longer really makes sense if you have classes and you have decorators and you have all this nice new technology, which really is better. It makes you more productive. So from that angle, we really have to change the framework on a very basic level to adjust to these new developments in the language and the ecosystem. So all the frameworks have to move, and Angular is just making this move happen for you. The other thing is that Angular 1, again, this was 5 years ago, the whole reactive programming, the way how you build UIs with data binding and this kind of stuff was completely new, right? So it was not entirely new. Of course, there were precedents in other programming environments, but for the web itself, it was completely new. There was no thing like that before. And so the Miško, in particular, and Igor and folks set out to build this thing, and they made design decisions that were totally reasonable at the time. But again, things have moved on, the world has changed, and we now know a whole bunch of things that we know how to do better. And that's, again, what we want to do. And these are not things that are making it more complicated. Most of the time, they're things where we just have built many things, and you realize, oh, this is actually a pattern. This is all the same pattern that we're repeating here in different aspects. And so we can unify and simplify them, and it's going to be a big boon to users, we think, because the number of things you have to understand in the framework is going to be fewer, and that's always a good thing. So one of the big things is simplicity. And as a first look at Angular 2, it might be a bit intimidating, right? You have classes which you might not have used before, and you have modules, and you have arrow functions, and decorators, and all this kind of stuff. But fundamentally, the question is, how many concepts do you have to understand to be productive in a framework? How many things do you have to remember to get right, to build nice applications with Angular? And so one of the things we used to have is this bunch of directives, right? So Angular implements a whole bunch of directives. You have ng key down and ng mouse leave and ng options and ng href and all this kind of stuff. And all of these directives are things that you as a user have to learn, have to remember, that we as a framework provider have to produce and document and work with. And it's a pain, frankly, right? This is a ton of code that we would rather not write if we could choose. And so the Angular 2 way of fixing that is saying, okay, we'll just change our binding system and our templating system to work with properties all the time, right? So what you're binding to is not text in the DOM, what you're binding to is a property. So you see here that input binds to value, the value property of the DOM node, the input node. And then we have events, like the click event, which comes in parentheses. The parentheses, the moniker to remember is, if it's a function call, then you use parentheses. Right? If it's a property, you use brackets to access it. And so if it's a two-way binding, you use both. That makes a bit less sense, but still. That's where my metaphor breaks down, sorry. But still, the point is that this makes things so much easier because you don't have to remember ng-click or ng-href, or like if you're using a UI library, you might have additional events that this UI library fires, and you have to remember which prefix to use and all this kind of stuff. And we just removed that, right? So it's much simpler now. You understand the DOM, you should do that, and then you just know, well, there's a value property on an input element. I'm just going to use brackets because it's a property, so I'm binding to the value property. Done, right? And that's, compared to this thing, it's much easier. It's much less knowledge to have in your brain all the time. So that's simplicity. The other thing that we're going for with simplicity is removing the core concept in the framework. And again, this is like controllers, directives, scopes. Some of these still exist in a shadow form, but essentially everything now is a component. And for me personally, building applications in Angular 1, it was always a bit of a cognitive dissonance that you have controllers with the router, so you have ng controller to the annotation, and at the same time you have directives, and the controllers were frankly easier to use, but then directives allow you to do different things, and it's when do I use which? It's kind of confusing. So this thing we just removed, right? There's no good point why this had to be. It was a remnant from the initial design of Angular when we built it 5 years ago, and so we carried these on, but it is not useful, and we have to remove this feature. And so we cannot remove that within the framework of Angular 1. We have to really change the framework from the ground up to be more generic and more capable in expressing these things. So where you used to have a directive maybe, or a controller, or something between, you don't quite know, you just have a component. And so in this example, we have a display component with a very imaginative name, and it has a property called Alice, or my name, which is Alice, the value, and then you put a couple of annotations on it. So you say, well, this is a component, and the selector to activate the component is display. So if you write an element called display, that's going to happen here. And then you have a view annotation, which is essentially the template of this component. Oh, things are coming down here. You have the template, which is exactly what you would expect from the template. And the point here is, there's no $scope, so you cannot make the confusion of, do I put something onto the scope? Do I put something onto the component itself? There's no element binding or scope binding, or all these properties that you know from directives are just replaced with this one simple, consistent way of expressing things. And this is ECMAScript 5, as you can probably tell. So this is the normal ECMAScript 5 syntax, and I think it's pretty workable. You can probably enhance it a bit with maybe a helper function or two. And then if you write it in TypeScript, it has this syntax. And that's one of the reasons why we are going with TypeScript. We want to support ES5. We think ES5 is important, that you can still use it. We want to support ES6. We think that's very important too, that you can just use plain ES6. But we do think that TypeScript allows us to have a so much nicer syntax, and it's so much more productive building applications using the syntax and using the TypeScript tooling, that we really want you to try it out. You don't have to use it. It's perfectly fine to not use it, but trying it out is really worth it. So again, we see the same. We have a component. It has a selector, so this is the trigger for it to be applied. We have a template for the component, and then we have just a regular ECMAScript 6 class with a property declaration, so that's TypeScript, and it has a constructor, and this.name equals Alice. So the code, again, if you squint quite a bit, it is very similar between ES5 and ES6. It does mostly the same thing. And then the other thing that we thought about in Angular 2 was performance. Angular 1 has a couple of very deep design decisions that managed us to move very quickly in the beginning, and there were good design decisions at the time. But now that the web has moved on, we've learned a lot about when to do DOM bindings, how to interleave DOM rendering and component evaluation, and your business logic execution. And with Angular 2, we were able to take a step back and say, okay, what makes sense, right? How should this really work? And we were able to really change things from the ground up. And so Angular 2 usually performs about 4 times faster than Angular 1 already. So that's a very, very big speed up. If you think about like something in your application that takes 1 second in Angular 1, it's going to be 250 milliseconds in Angular 2. So it goes from noticeable delay, 1 second is kind of annoying, right, to you just don't notice it at all. 250 milliseconds is about the perception level. 200 milliseconds is what a human can still perceive as a delay at all. And so this really allows you, factor 4 doesn't sound as such a great number, but it really allows to do things that were hard before. And the other thing there is that Angular 1 is has reached its platform of performance that is possible with it. So we can tell from the releases of Angular 1, it's okay, but it's not getting much better. There's no low-hanging fruit. There's no big things that you could do to improve it a lot at this point. And so with Angular 2, we see not only is it a lot faster already, it also is going down faster, and down is good in performance, right? So it's actually improving a lot over the last couple of months while we're developing it. So that's a good thing too, and that's very important, right? Performance, being fast, is a driver for application adoption. And then the other thing that we worked on, and I'm going to talk about that a bit more in productivity, is toolability. So Angular 1 is nice, and you can use a whole bunch of tools for it. We wrote tools for it, like the Karma test runner, that is a very nice thing. Or, of course, you can use the Chrome developer tools, all these kinds of things. And so Angular 1 has substantial tooling for it, but there's a whole bunch of things that are just not possible to do in Angular 1, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that. So one of the reasons we did Angular 2 was we had to depart, for example, from the template syntax in Angular 1 because it was just not toolable, not statically toolable. And so productivity in tooling is a very important thing. It's very dear to my heart, so I'm working on that quite a bit in the context of Angular. And the question, of course, there's always, what is that even? What are you talking about? What's developer productivity? And this is a very big topic. It's, you can talk about all kinds of various aspects of it, but effectively, when everything is said and done, the question is, how long does it take to do X, right? How long do I spend, how much time do I spend in front of a computer to achieve a certain outcome that I want? So how long does it take me to implement this component? How long does it take me to figure out why this thing doesn't work? How long does it take me to understand why my application is crashing with a particular error, or just how long does it take me to type and to build something working with an API? So developer productivity from that angle is really quite simple. And the other thing that we can see there is that tooling really makes you faster. And you might think, like, tooling, am I actually using a lot of tooling in my day-to-day work? And you can, of course, be in this place where you just put a script tag on your website and you're done, right? So you put a script tag on your website, and then you just build a couple of application directives in the web page that you're working on, in the HTML file, maybe even, and that's done, right? You see that there's hardly any tooling involved. But even for people who do this thing, usually you have a lot of tooling already going for you. So you have version control, you have automated tests, I hope, you have linters and various other analysis tools. Do you have something that serves your application development mode? Do you hopefully have something that's doing bundling for you, that's minifying your application, and maybe even you're compiling your application? So maybe you're even renaming properties and really minifying your application during delivery. So all of us are already using quite a bunch of tooling, and this tooling really makes us faster. So one of the things that version control is a big aspect of tooling. How long does it take me to undo a mistake? If I do something silly and I figure out all of this was a bad idea, it happens to me all the time, then how long does it take me to go back to a sane state? And git reset -- hard head is one of those tooling things. And if you don't use version control, you might remember that from the dark ages, then yes, that's a total pain if you don't have it. There is one thing, though, in this context that is quite interesting. There's static and there's dynamic tooling. So static tooling is stuff like your version control system, for example, but also essentially everything that helps you with development without executing your code. So the linters that we've talked about before are definitely static tooling. Compilers are static tooling. IDEs are things that work with your source code. Your editor works with your source code without actually executing it. So all of that is static tooling. And then we have a whole bunch of dynamic tooling, like unit tests that execute your code. You have live reload tools, for example. You have the Chrome developer tools, in particular the console, the REPL, as many people call it. You have stuff like batarang. So all of these things are things that work interactively with your code. They actually run the actual code and inspect properties on the code and all this kind of stuff. The thing to keep in mind here is you want both, right? Both are super awesome, both are appropriate for the right aspects. So for example, testing is just, you can't do it without, you can't test your code without executing the code. So you actually want the dynamic property of unit test tools. But on the other hand, there are many things where it's really hard to actually build this kind of tooling if you do have to execute the code. For example, linters are, you couldn't really build a linter within JavaScript. You have to actually look at the code from the outside and understand the code to be a good linter. And the same is true for an IDE. If you want to give somebody the ability to autocomplete on their source code or to rename symbols in their source code, this is an activity you do on the source code itself. With Angular 1, we were mostly focused on the dynamic tools because at the time, 5 years ago, JavaScript was everything was very dynamic. There were hardly any tools that were working with the source code itself. And so all of the tooling that we built, Karma and Batarang and all this kind of stuff, was centered around running your code in the browser, inspecting your code in the browser, helping you develop as your application runs. With Angular 2, we keep that, so we want to definitely keep this dynamic aspect of JavaScript because that's one of the things that make it fun to work with JavaScript. But at the same time, we think we can make you a lot more productive if we add more on the static side. So one of the things in Angular 1, and this is one of the reasons why we had to rebuild the template syntax in Angular 2, is if you look at this code, you have my awesome directive, name of most of my directives. Then you have two attributes on it. One is called attr, and it's maybe an expression. And the other one is attribute 2, or just text. And so one of the things you see here is I cannot tell if attribute 1 or attribute 2 are expressions that are JavaScript code that have to be evaluated, or are they just random text on a document. And it's impossible to tell the difference in Angular 1. Even if you put a lot of effort into it and you think a long time, you cannot actually make this decision without executing code. If you execute the directive that backs this, my awesome directive, if you execute the code, of course, you can make it happen. But it's hard to tell without running the code. And so there's certain things that are just impossible. You cannot, for example, provide autocompletion in an IDE. You can't actually have your cursor in the attribute tag and provide useful autocompletion because you just don't know if it's an expression or if it's just some text on the DOM. Or you cannot take this template and turn it into very efficient JavaScript code that is not parsed at delivery time. If you deliver your application to your users, of course you would rather not spend the time of parsing this document fragment again and working with it again. You would just convert it to JavaScript code and directly run it in the browser of the user. And you can't do this because you can't tell the difference. And so the departure from that with Angular 2 is that we changed the syntax because this way we can actually tell that the bracket syntax tells us, okay, whatever comes into this attribute is definitely an expression, so we know that we have to treat it like JavaScript code. So we know we can do autocompletion on it, we can do all this tooling on it. The attribute below, attribute 2, is just text. Right? So we actually definitely know that this is not going to be expanded, it's not going to be evaluated against the scope or anything like that. So definitely this is just text, and we can just copy it into the output. Of course, you could have curly braces in the text, and then it would be evaluated within the curly braces, but you have a definite distinction between these two modes of operation. And this is a small thing, right? It doesn't actually make much of a difference for you as the engineer, like whether you write brackets around your attribute name is not such a big departure from before, but for the tooling underneath, it makes a huge difference because suddenly it enables all these features that we would really want to deliver. So Angular 2 can analyze its template statically, can tell what's an expression, what's a selector, what's an event, what's a binding. And this is awesome because template compilation, autocompletion in the templates, we can validate if your template is correct. We can tell you, hey, you mistyped this expression there, or this is definitely not a valid expression. So we can give you errors earlier and make it easier to tell if this application is valid at all. And also, a side effect of all these things, as we make things more static, is that we find it often leads to better code. So it often leads to more understandable code in particular. So one of the problems here is our automated tooling cannot tell the difference between an expression and just text. But the other problem is I, as a human, cannot tell the difference between an expression and just text. If I just read my application code, if I just read the templates, I cannot tell if attribute 2 is going to be evaluated or not. And so if I have a large application, I have many different templates and many different expressions, I cannot no longer tell how my application behaves without reading the directive that is backing this too. And that's actually a problem too. That's a productivity problem because it's just harder to understand your own code. And if you come back to your application a year later, you might just not understand what's going on at all. So that's a nice side effect of this move to be a bit more analyzable, a bit more static, to have this kind of feature. And we do the same, essentially in the same vein, we work with TypeScript. So TypeScript is adding a whole bunch of things to JavaScript, but one of the important things is it adds static types. And it actually adds them in a very nimble way. You can use types, but you don't have to. TypeScript doesn't force you to put type annotations all over your code. And that also enables a very nice mode for us, because we can say, we as the framework provider, right? We're building code that you should hopefully want it to use it. And so we're building all this code, and we can actually put type annotations in our code. And so because we know that our code is probably used by quite a bunch of people, and they're going to work with it for a long time, we actually have a big incentive to put all these type annotations in our code, because it makes it more easy to reuse our code in your application. But if you don't really care about the type annotations all that much, if you just want to get something done quickly, you don't have to bother with that. And this is a very nice trade-off, because it allows somebody like a framework provider to put more effort into stuff, and it still allows to consume it in a quick and easy fashion. So static types are great for a framework in that sense. We have sort of by design, we have always correct API documentation, so you can always tell, oh, is this taking a number, is this taking a string? We can drive our documentation generation process off these type annotations, so we are always correct there. It also leads to saner APIs. So if you've ever written a link function in a directive in Angular 1, so the link function takes these parameters and then it returns. It's a function, or sometimes it actually, if it's a compile function, it returns a function, and so you end up with this API that is, oh, I get a value, and then maybe it's a string, maybe it's a function, maybe it's an object, maybe a banana flies by. You don't quite know what's going on there, and that again makes code hard to understand. And we're very sorry about those APIs, by the way. So expect slightly more sane APIs in the future, because we're just sort of forced a bit to not go completely crazy on things with this. And the other thing, of course, which I've mentioned a lot, is auto-completion. Auto-completion is a big deal for me, in particular if you're working with a substantial API like Angular. You actually have a whole bunch of things that you might just not remember. So if you have the code that puts an add component on your component, is it template URL? What's the exact name of these fields? And of course, you can learn it over time. I think most of you are probably proficient in Angular 1, that you just remember how these things work. But it just keeps that much mental load off your brain, right? You can sort of relax there and focus on other things in your work, and that's a good thing too. So auto-completion is a big deal. What I personally find very important for me is go-to symbol. So if you have a larger application, finding out where this particular symbol comes from, if you're using your model objects and you want to figure out if this name thing is actually the author name or something like that in your API, that's very useful too. And it also enables us to make safer API changes. So if we change our API in Angular 1, it happened rarely, but occasionally it happened that we made a change or we broke people. So applications would stop working with this change and we had to fix it somehow. And again, TypeScript allows us to be a bit more knowledgeable about if this change is going to break people. We can analyze if our API changes in a way that would break people. So that's a good thing too. And again, this is optional, right? So you don't have to use it. You can use ES5, you can use ES6 if you want to. We really do think it's a huge improvement, so you should try it, but nobody's forcing you into it. And so the question originally was, how long does it take me to do X, right? And we can see how TypeScript really improves all these X's. So how long does it take to write a component? Well, you can see that I can write my component for a pizza order, and you can see how I get auto-completion on its styles or style URLs, and I know that it's going to be an array of strings that has these styles that are being linked into the application there. And this just makes me faster. This just makes me the typing itself is not such a big burden. Like the styles, I can still manage to type that successfully, but having the auto-completion is so nice because you have the safety net. Otherwise, you would save the file, reload in the browser, see that it doesn't work, and then you change the thing again, you reload in the browser, and then at some point you go to the documentation and figure out why you're mistyping this thing all the time. And in this case, I just get the auto-completion, I'm just done. And the same thing is renaming, for example, right? So if I decide to become hipster and rename pizza to flatbread in my store, I can just do that with a single command, more or less. I can rebrand my store as hipster with just a single keystroke. It's pretty cool. So again, that's something that's just making it so much easier to work with your own application. And then the other thing is, if you upgrade your application and maybe you're a bigger team and people make different changes, it happens that you just make a change, you forget to rename something, or your upstream API that you're using changes, or you're importing a component to your application and the API of the component has changed. And again, we can see how this just tells you, hey, this property no longer exists. And so what could be a multi-hour hunt asking like, why the heck does it tell me that undefined is not a function? You can actually get this thing, right? And it's so much better. So with that being said, this is our Angular 2 reasoning, so to say, right? So that's why we are doing this thing, why we're trying to re-implement the whole framework, and how we think this will be a big help for you, we hope. And then the question is, of course, what's the next steps? So the future is, oh wait, wrong future. This is the wrong future. This is the future, the Angular 2 future. So Angular 2 future, we actually think that Angular 2 is on a very good trajectory. We're going to ship the framework with final version 1.0 of Angular 2.0, which doesn't make it Angular 3, I think. Will ship in 2016. We have very large Google internal applications that are already in production right now using Angular 2. So we're very confident that the application framework as a whole is sane, it works. We get feedback from teams at Angular that not only is it working, it also makes a whole bunch of things way easier, in particular sharing UI components, that you don't have to rewrite everything yourself, but you can just reuse other people's code. That is a big deal. That makes things a lot easier for big teams in particular. And so we think that the core framework works. We don't only think that we actually have proof. It's healthy. It's fast. It's performant. It enables people to build nice applications. So all of that is working pretty well. And now we're focusing on the ecosystem. And this is one thing is tooling. So we think it's way too hard still to get started with an application. You have this decision paralysis where you have dozens and dozens of different tools and frameworks and build tools and bundles and package managers, all this kind of stuff. So we'll try to pave one way that we think is well working and is known to, well understood and known to work, and make it possible to have a much faster startup time if you start a new application. One of the things we're working there is Angular CLI, which will essentially allow you to start an application within a couple of hours. And then the other thing is we want to look at the workflow. So we want to make sure that the entire application lifecycle, so to say, from like I have an idea to I actually have an application that's shipping, that is having new versions, that we keep working on, all of this process across building it and designing it is working well for people, and it's also fast. So one of the things we really care about is not only the application speed, but also the speed of the developer themselves is a big deal to us. And then, of course, with the new framework, many of the things that we're used to from Angular 1 are still valid, but some of the things are no longer, there are no more directives. So the best practices that we have developed as a community around best practices for these things are gone or no longer applicable. So we will have to develop new best practices. We will have to understand how to actually be productive, and we have ideas in that regard, but of course you're the judge of this, and you're the people who actually work with the framework and should develop these ideas too. And then we will also work on third-party components. So we're already very busy working on material design components for Angular 2, which we hope to see. We're already seeing visible progress, but we hope to get much better in the next quarter. But also, there are many more UI libraries that we want to support, and we want to build an ecosystem where it's really easy to pull in third-party libraries into your application. And we want to help people go to 2.0, because we really think it's so much better to build 2.0 applications. It's so much more fun for me personally to work on Angular 2 applications, that we want to help people to come along. So there's ng upgrade, and we will help people to get into the new world. And so then that's the point where we really need support from you guys too. We want you to try out Angular 2. Just go through the tutorial, try any of we have flavors of the tutorial. There's an ES5, there's a Typescript tutorial, this kind of stuff. Try it out, see if you like it. Give us feedback about things that don't work, things that are too hard, things that are too complicated to get working. We would love to see people build and share awesome new UI components for the new system. So that's going to be a big deal, that you're going to have an ecosystem around these components. We want people to say, hey, this is, I tried this out, and this is how it works really smoothly. So please do define best practices, tweet about them, write about them, say like how you build Angular 2 components, and drive the community process with that. So that's the big thing for this year, is going to be spreading the ideas, spreading the knowledge, spreading the components, spreading the code, and get together as a community there. With that, I would like to thank you for your attention. There's not going to be a question session in this session, but we were going to be over there at the Xebia coffee bar. And so if you want to come over, Igor is I think he's there. I think he should be. And so Igor Miner is going to be there with me, and we're going to answer your questions. Thank you.